All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for tuning in to part 2 of our Introduction to Lake Management lecture series. We're going to be talking a lot about aquatic plants in this webinar. We're also going to touch on just the basic intro that I gave for the first webinar, because I do think we have some people who weren't able to watch that one. So I just want to touch on that briefly. My name is Lindsay Yoder. I'm the Aquatic Programs Coordinator for Teatown Lake Reservation. And I'm also the Aquatic Invasive Species Program Coordinator for the Lower Hudson Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. And as that title would suggest, this is more my forte than algae. So I have a lot more information on plants for you all today, and hope I am going to be able to answer all of your questions that you might have. So a little bit about how this presentation is going to go. Like I said, we're going to do kind of the intro to lake management, similar to what we did in the last webinar. And then we'll go into some specific native plants and how they can become a problem, as well as a little more information on invasive plants. We'll do some plant ID, and then we'll talk about survey methods and protocol for assessing your lake and how my crew does it, which is going to be really important if you want to do any specific management, because obviously if you want to try to do management, you need to know what you have. And then we'll go into some best management practices. So let's get to it. All right. So again, the goal of this series is really to help anyone who is interested in managing their lake, whether you're a homeowner or a municipal leader who is tasked with managing a lake, or someone who works at a preserve. And you really want to learn how to utilize a holistic and integrated lake management approach, with the effort of eventually creating a healthy and self-sustaining lake. And as I touched on in the last webinar, that's a pretty lofty goal, and it's not something that you might necessarily ever be able to achieve. But when you're trying to decide a management plan for your lake, that should be what you're striving for. Even if it never happens, you want to set yourself up for success, and you should be seeking the best way to do that. And so the layout of this series is, of course, designed to encourage consideration of both in-lake and watershed management. So what's going on inside and what's going on around the watershed. And that's going to help you treat the causes and not just the symptoms. So again, you have to consider your lake, especially with plant management. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. You don't all have the same plants in your lake. So you're going to have very different management options depending on what you have. And those management options are going to also depend on the size of your watershed, the amount of land you have draining into the lake and introducing pollution and nutrients. It's also going to influence the slope and erosion and surrounding land use, so logging, or if you have a lot of area paved over for housing, that's going to heavily influence what's going into the lake. And then you also have your inlet community, both plants and animals, and the ecosystem structure. So aquatic plants specifically, well, they have a lot of benefits, and we definitely need aquatic plants for nursery habitat for fish and tadpoles. Plant roots help secure sediment and prevent erosion within the lake. Plants also filter contaminants. So if you have a highly polluted area, those plants might help you get rid of some of that inside of the lake. And the plants obviously also produce oxygen through photosynthesis. But having too much of anything is not good. So in excess, plants can actually reduce biodiversity. And that's not just talking about plant biodiversity. That's also talking about other primary and secondary consumer diversity. You have large monocultures of a specific plant that maybe only hosts one or two specific species of plankton, for example. You might reduce the overall biodiversity of plankton within your lake. And then, yes, of course, plants produce oxygen, but they can also decrease oxygen, both circulation and the actual amount of dissolved oxygen within the lake. If you have a large monoculture of plants, you can encourage stagnant water, which is obviously decreasing the amount of circulation of dissolved oxygen. And then the dieback of all of those plants help to produce those algal blooms that we were talking about in the last webinar. And that's just because all those plants die back and they release excess nutrients into the water. And then that algae, when it dies off, also depletes the oxygen available. It can also become a safety hazard and become unsuitable for recreation. There have been reports of people drowning due to excess plant growth. It can obviously get stuck in your boat motors and clog water pipes. And then it can also alter the fish community. When you have really dense plant communities, it might shift your equilibrium between, larger, more desirable species and smaller species. And that's because larger species can't forage as efficiently in really dense plant beds as smaller species can. So if you have a really large infestation of any plant, eventually the larger fish are going to get pushed out, and they're not going to be able to forage. So you'll start to see more smaller panfish, which is why many of the lakes in this region have a lot of those smaller fish as opposed to the more larger, desirable sportfish. So how do plants become a problem? Well, it's very similar to how algae becomes a problem. So the major contributors, we talked about the limiting factor in the algae webinar. We talked about phosphorus being that limiting factor. And just to go over what that means again, essentially the limiting factor is whatever is present in the least amount within the lake, that's what's going to affect growth. So if you have a lake that is very clear and has a lot of sunlight and otherwise would be a great spot for photosynthesis, but you're lacking in nitrogen, you're not going to have as much plant growth. But for plants, nitrogen instead of phosphorus is the limiting factor. So if you have an abundance of nitrogen, maybe through excess fertilizer running into the lake, you will all of a sudden have a plant problem. And that happens due to eutrophication. As we mentioned before, eutrophication is not unhealthy. It's a completely natural process that just relates to the productivity of a lake. But what we deal with here in the lower Hudson region is cultural eutrophication from logging, lakeshore development, septic systems, fertilizers, erosion, and animals. I get a lot of questions about Canada geese and how those would influence plant growth. And if you have a goose problem, you will also have a nutrient problem. But one thing we didn't talk about necessarily with algae is sedimentation and how sedimentation influences plant growth. Again, this is also a natural process. Lakes are naturally sediment traps and will all eventually fill in. But the sources of sediment load that are very similar to the sources of cultural eutrophication. So we have an extreme amount of deposition of eroded materials from runoff. And then you also have the dieback of excessive vegetation, which settles on the lake bottom as organic matter. And this is obviously problematic for two reasons. One, your lake fills in. And second, that excessive plant growth that releases the nutrients in anoxic conditions will then lead to algal blooms and further plant growth. So long-term goal of integrated watershed management, that is the whole purpose of this series. So when we're considering both watershed and in-lake management and treating the causes and not the symptoms, I wanted to show you this graphic specifically of how sedimentation and plant growth are related, both to what's going on outside and inside. So as you can see, two things that happen outside the lake. You've got surface runoff and septic system leaching, both of which can contribute to plant growth, and surface runoff, which contributes to sedimentation. That's what's going on outside of the lake. But inside of the lake, you've got sedimentation influencing plant growth, and then plant growth influencing sedimentation, and it just keeps going. So this is a really good example of how you need to treat both what's going on outside and what's going on inside, because if you just do one or the other, it's not going to be effective necessarily in treating your problem. All right, so some specifics on aquatic vegetation, the good, the bad, and the annoying. First, some important terms to know. There are more than just weeds. We can't just lump them all together in the same category because there are some really important distinctions. We have native species. This is Vallisneria americana, or water celery, and this is one of the good guys. And we have non-native species. This doesn't necessarily mean it's invasive. It just means it's not native. So many of our ornamental plants like tulips or pansies, these are not native, but they aren't aggressive enough to ever become invasive. And then we've got noxious plants. Poison ivy is a really great example. Poison ivy is a native plant, even though it's really annoying to us. And then we've got invasive plants, and these are non-native species which cause or have the potential to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. And we're going to get a little bit more in depth about invasive species, but first I want to talk about some plant types and then some specific native plants that are good for the environment. We've got emergent plants. These are going to be plants that have their stem and leaves primarily out of the water. They do need wet feet. They're found at the water's edge. These are more wetland plants. This is an invasive wetland plant, it's purple loosestrife. But we've got some good wetland plants, like pickerel weed is a great one. And then we have floating leaf plants. These are rooted in water up to 8 feet. So these are what you're going to find mostly around the shallow littoral zone of your lake. You're not going to see these growing in the center of the lake unless you have a really shallow lake. And the bulk of the plant rests on the water's surface. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's a floating leaf plant. Most of it's floating on the surface. And then you've got submersed plants. These are the plants that grow entirely underwater, and some will grow up to 20 or 30 feet long even. And they can have emergent parts. They might have floral spikes or small rosettes that sit on top of the water. And then you've got free floating plants. These are the rootless plants that float in the upper portion of the water column. So this is bladderwort, a pretty common floating plant we have in the region, and also some problematic ones you're familiar with probably are duckweed and watermeal. Those are also some rootless floating plants. So some species of natives are more desirable than others, obviously, so I wanted to touch on those briefly. Water celery, as I mentioned, it's really important if you have this species that you're aware of it because it's great habitat. Just by looking at it, you can tell the structure is a lot simpler than some other plants, and there's a lot of open space available. It's not very tall, so it's low growing. So it's great habitat for fish and great for that equilibrium fish community. And then it's also a great food resource. Waterweed, I have Alodia canadensis. There's also Alodia natalis. Those are two waterweed species that can be found here. This can get to nuisance levels in some people's opinion, but again, this is a great native plant, great food, and great habitat. I mentioned the bladderworts. Bladderworts are really incredible plants. They're actually carnivorous. So if you look up close, you can see whether or not it has fed recently because the bladders will either be full or they won't, but they feed on plankton. And then we've got pondweeds in the Potamogeton genus. We have dozens of native pondweeds. All are great habitat and food resources for waterfowl specifically. So it's important that you know if you have some of these more desirable native species before you do treatment. And that's because a lot of treatment isn't necessarily selective. So when you're deciding whether you want to treat some nuisance species, you want to make sure you're protecting certain areas that might have these more desirable species. So some nuisances. We have coontail. This is very common in our region. This picture here, this is at Teatown Lake. And you can see it's just a forest of coontail. And this is pretty much what the entire lake looks like. It likes fresh or brackish water, but it's really tolerant of pretty much anything. It can tolerate lower sunlight, high turbidity, high productivity. That makes it a really great competitor with invasive species as well. This can spread through fragmentation or vegetative reproduction. So if you break off one piece of the plant, an entirely new root system can grow and it can establish elsewhere. And it also can spread through seed. And how we can identify this, it's very brittle, almost evergreen-like, tree-like, and it stays like that pretty much the whole season. Obviously, it'll die to some extent, but it doesn't die off and lose its color as quickly as some of the other aquatic plants you'll see. And because it's so brittle, it does hold its shape out of water. It's got 5 to 12 of these forked leaves arranged in a whorl. And if you look at each one of these leaves, there's 2 prongs. There's another native hornwort species that looks very similar to this, but it has 3 prongs instead of 2. And but it's also native, but it looks very similar. And then coontail is also denser, more towards the stem, giving it its name. It does look a little bit like a raccoon tail. And the stem is hollow, and it's a pretty short plant by some standards. It gets up to about 8 feet long. And this plant is really easy to pull up, so it might be tempting to treat manually, and that's because it doesn't have true roots. So it's very easy to just pull up, which also means it's very easy to fragment. All right, another very common one here in this region that becomes a problem really quickly is white water lily. So again, it likes fresh or brackish water. And this is one that's going to hug the shoreline, usually 4 feet or less. Teatown Lake is covered with white water lily in addition to coontail, and that's because most of the lake is 4 feet or less. It grows primarily by rhizomes. And you have probably seen these. These are really large, spongy, almost tentacle-like things floating on the surface. I get a lot of questions about these because they look so alien-like. But this contributes to why it's so hard to manage this plant, because you really have to get this entire rhizome to actually get rid of it. You can't just pull it up simply. So probably don't need help identifying, but it is a floating leaf plant. The leaves are round with sharply pointed lobes. It is the quintessential frog on a lily pad cartoon. It's got purple undersides, and its flowers are white with up to 25 petals. But I have seen in a couple of lakes actually in this region plants with pinkish flowers, and I have not figured out if that's just a different cultivar or a completely different species that maybe is not native. It's not sacred lotus, which some people have asked me, but no. So if you see something with pink flowers, feel free to shoot me an image, because I'd like to look more into that. All right, and this next one, it's got a very similar habitat and ecology to white water lily, so I'm just going to go over identification. This is the Nuphar genus. So this is yellow pond lily, spatterdock, I think cow lily is another name. There are a few species. It's a floating leaf plant. The leaves are heart-shaped and, very large, almost like an elephant ear. And the lobes are curved as opposed to pointed like the white water lily. It's got wavy edged leaves, and the flowers are yellow and cup-like and grow on stalks. The leaves also grow on stalks, and depending on the species you look at, it will be either winged, like there will be wings on the stalks, or they'll be completely round. Native plants are not my exact specialty, so I don't focus too much on differentiating between these, but either way, they're all native. All right, so a little bit more detail about invasive species and going into that definition. So non-native. This doesn't just mean that it's not native to the United States. It could mean that it's not native to just a region. So we have a few pretty good examples of that. One is the sea lamprey, which is a parasitic fish, but it's actually native to the Hudson River, and it's invasive in the Great Lakes region. And we also have variable leaf milfoil, which is an invasive plant here in our area, but it's actually native just as close as southern New Jersey and western New York. Its native range is pretty interesting, from southeast Florida up to Michigan, but it's not actually native here. And the first report of it was in, I think, the 1950s. And then the second part of the definition, that it causes environmental or economic harm or harm to human health. And they don't all have to do all three, but of course there are some that do, like the zebra mussel. The zebra mussel is a filter feeder. It depletes plankton from the water column, removing available food for smaller fish that would in turn feed larger sport fish that are prized in the recreational fishery. And as it filters the water, it also deposits high concentrations of toxins like polychlorinated biphenyls or PCBs, which are then found in some of the fish we eat from the Hudson River. Obviously, this is just one example, but we've got plants that do that too. Water chestnut is a great one. It blocks sunlight from the native species below. It causes stagnant flow and costs millions of dollars in treatment. And then it also can hurt us by those really sharp seeds that we step on the sides of the Hudson River. And this isn't part of the definition, obviously, but most invasive species, the negative impacts outweigh the benefits. A lot of invasives do have some sort of benefit in some way. I mean, they're all plants, so there's got to be something good about them. And they might provide habitat or food for some species. If we look at Phragmites, Phragmites is it's a buffer plant. It takes up excess nutrients and blocks pollution, shores up shorelines from storm surges. But its negative impacts far outweigh that. It crowds out all the other native species, other native plant species that would also be doing that same job. And it also only provides habitat for a few species, whereas native plants like cattails would host habitat for far more species. So something else that I get asked a lot is why a plant is invasive, why a non-native plant is then able to become invasive. Because as I mentioned, another key factor is that not every non-native species does become invasive. So there are three things or three steps. I'm sure there are more than three, but the ones I want to talk about, I'm going to talk about here. So one is propagule pressure. And what that essentially means is the amount of something that's introduced. Obviously, if someone brings over just one plant, it's not going to be able to survive as well as someone brings over, a whole boatload of plants. So the amount of a species that's initially introduced is going to have a big impact on its success as an invader. This is relevant for both plants and animals as well. If you only have one of something, it's not going to be able to survive as easily. Additionally, there are environmental parameters that a species is going to need to survive and reproduce, such as water temperature, diet, or salinity. So like a tropical freshwater fish that only eats fruits and seeds found in their native stream is probably going to be limited by the colder water up here and also the absence of their preferred diet. So in that case, that species would be considered a specialist, but invasive species are usually generalists. So they are able to survive and reproduce and spread due to their tolerance of a wide range of environmental conditions, which is what makes them so problematic and then allows them to successfully outcompete native species who maybe can't tolerate some certain situations. So now let's go specifically into aquatic invasive species. We have two terrestrial habitats here. The one on the left is covered in a forest of multiflora rose. But you can tell, even if you couldn't identify this plant, you can tell there's something going on because it's completely overtaken the entire area. And then alternatively, we've got this, more mountainous region. And this, you might be more likely to notice when something pops up that's a little bit strange, something you haven't seen before. And then we've got the Hudson River. And I just want you to take a second and just try and guess where I'm going with this. But the Hudson River has an estimated 150 aquatic invasive species, but you wouldn't know it just by looking at this picture or just by looking at the river. And that is really the crux of aquatic invasive species. It is a lot harder for us to notice when they arrive. It's usually much too late when we do finally notice them. And that contributes to the real problem with aquatic invasive species. If you've ever seen anything about invasives, you've probably seen this curve. And essentially, as time goes on, an infestation grows and the control costs grow. And this says here, public awareness typically begins where eradication is unlikely and intense effort is required. And I would say for aquatic invaders, it's probably a little bit higher. People will not notice something until it is completely topping out the water column and they can't move I get emails weekly of pictures of plants that are completely covering the surface, and people asking what it is. So it just takes a lot longer for people to notice, but also there are some plants that just have extreme exponential growth, and it might only be one season before it's topping out certain areas. So invasive species can be introduced through a number of different mechanisms known as vectors. For aquatic invasive species, the primary vectors for species introduction usually depends on whether it was introduced on purpose or by accident. So a couple of examples: aquaculture, both plants and animals, either for food, for human consumption, or use in commercial or recreational capacities. And then, of course, we've got the aquarium or ornamental trades. Both aquariums and ornamental ponds are really popular for invasive floating plants. And then they also get introduced as biocontrol of other invasive species, like this grass carp here. Also, in many cases, these species are not introduced intentionally to a natural system, but they're able to escape containment or of some kind. So one being ballast water from international cargo ships. That's the leading way that most aquatic invaders enter here. And then also through Erie Canal, or through interconnected canals. I said Erie Canal because that's what I was going to discuss. A lot of things get introduced into the Great Lakes region and then are able to make their way into the Hudson River via the Erie Canal. And then we've also got things like natural disasters, hurricanes, or tsunamis that will pick up whole structures from one country and carry it across the ocean into the US. So, like I said, an invasive species might not negatively impact the environment, the economy, or human health all at once, but in many circumstances, these impacts are all connected through interference with the services that the environment provides for us. These are known as ecosystem services. That can include things like primary production, such as phytoplankton and plant growth, food and freshwater availability, water quality, and recreation or aesthetic value, among many others. Very rarely will an invasive species impair some component of the ecology of the lake snow region without additional consequences to our everyday lives. So just a few examples of some of the impacts. From an environmental perspective, they are competition for food and habitat. In the case of aquatic vegetation, they can block sunlight and prevent photosynthesis of lower growing native species. They also cause food web disruption. Obviously, if an invasive species comes in and other maybe animals aren't aware of whether or not they can eat that species, that's going to disrupt the food web quite a bit. Also, the limitation of diversity in plankton, the plankton community, is going to disrupt the food web. It also causes water quality impairment due to that low dissolved oxygen that can occur during dieback. From an economic perspective, heavy plant growth obviously can decrease property values and aesthetics. It causes damage to infrastructure, damage to the recreation and ecotourism industry. It also pulls funds from other projects, specifically in endangered species projects. If you have invasive species that you have to treat first, you're now pulling funds from the actual endangered species restoration. And then from a human health perspective, like I mentioned, drowning from plant overgrowth is a real thing. Physical harm, such as the seeds on water chestnut, and then the proliferation of harmful algal blooms that can occur during dieback.